Imagine this, a frail 90-year-old woman who spent her entire life building a home filled with memories, laughter, and love, suddenly handed an eviction notice by her own HOA. No compassion, no mercy, just cold paperwork demanding she leave the place she'd called home for over 60 years. Her crime? A small crack in her driveway, faded paint on the shutters, and a garden she no longer had the strength to maintain. What started as a cruel notice turned into a battle that shook the entire neighborhood, because when people saw what the HOA was doing, they refused to stay silent. Martha Jacobs had lived in Willow Creek since the early 1960s, back when she and her late husband, George, first bought the little two-bedroom house. The neighborhood was just beginning to grow. They planted an oak tree in the front yard, which had now stretched tall and wide, shading half the block. The house wasn't the fanciest, but it was home. Over the years, Martha hosted block parties, taught neighborhood kids how to bake cookies, and even took care of pets when families went away on trips. Everyone knew her, everyone loved her, but time catches everyone, and by 90, Martha was moving slower than before. She still shuffled out to collect her newspaper, still wore her sun hat to water the flowers, but it was harder to bend, harder to mow, harder to paint. She lived on her small pension and Social Security check, stretching every dollar carefully. To her, the peeling paint and the cracked driveway didn't mean much. The house was safe, warm, and full of memories. That was enough. The HOA didn't see it that way. The new board president, a sharp-tongued woman named Diane, had moved into Willow Creek only 2 years earlier. She prided herself on raising standards and running the HOA like a business. Diane hated Martha's home. She said the shutters were an eyesore, the driveway dangerous, and that the garden looked unkempt. She complained that Martha's property lowered the aesthetic appeal of the whole community. But rather than offering help to an elderly widow, the board voted to fine her. At first, Martha thought it was a mistake. A $250 violation notice arrived in the mail, then another, then a letter warning that unpaid fines could lead to legal action. Martha tried calling the HOA office, but Diane was cold. Rules are rules. Mrs. Jacobs, if you can't keep up your property, perhaps this isn't the right community for you. The words cut deep. Martha had been there longer than anyone. She was the community. She paid her dues faithfully for decades, baked cookies for fundraisers, and donated plants for the clubhouse. Now, at 90, she was being told she didn't belong. Weeks passed, and the letters escalated. $250 became $500, then $750, with legal fees tacked on. Martha's mailbox became a source of dread. She stopped sleeping well, her appetite faded, and she quietly began packing some things in boxes, terrified that she might actually lose her home. Then came the worst blow. A bright red notice taped to her front door. Eviction proceedings initiated. The HOA was suing Martha, and unless she paid thousands of dollars in fines and fees, she would be forced out. When her neighbor, Tom Miller, saw the notice, he was furious. Tom was a retired firefighter who had lived next door for 20 years. He knew Martha well, knew the kindness she had shown his children when they were little, knew the struggles she'd faced when George passed away. Tom stormed into the HOA meeting that evening with the notice in hand. "How dare you?" he shouted across the conference table. "This woman is 90 years old. She's lived here longer than this HOA has even existed. And you're trying to throw her out over cracked pavement and paint." Diane didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair with a smug smile. "Mr. Miller, we all agreed to community standards when we moved here. If Mrs. Jacobs can't maintain her property, that's not our fault. We're protecting property values. It's business, nothing personal. Business." Tom's voice shook with rage. "She's not a business. She's a human being, a neighbor. You can't just erase her like she doesn't matter." But Diane and her allies on the board refused to budge. They insisted the fine stood, and unless Martha complied, they would pursue full eviction. That night, Tom walked home with his fists clenched, his jaw tight, and a determination burning in his chest. He looked at Martha's little house, the light glowing softly in her window, and he made a silent vow. If the HOA wanted a fight, then a fight is exactly what they were going to get. Tom knew that going head-to-head with the HOA wasn't going to be easy. They had lawyers, money from dues, and a reputation for being ruthless. But he also knew something else. Martha had something far more powerful, the respect and love of her neighbors. For decades, she had been the quiet heartbeat of Willow Creek, and now it was time for the community to decide if they would stand by her, or let her be crushed. The very next morning, Tom printed copies of the eviction notice and slid them under doors, posted them in the community Facebook group, and taped one to the clubhouse bulletin board with a handwritten note that read, "This is what they're doing to Martha Jacobs. She's 90 years old. She's lived here longer than any of us, and now they want to throw her out over a cracked driveway. Is this who we are?" By evening, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Dozens of neighbors called, outraged, parents who remembered Martha teaching their kids to bake cookies, young couples who she had welcomed with homemade jam when they first moved in, and even newer residents who had only spoken to her once but remembered her kindness. People were shocked, angry, and ashamed that the board had sunk so low. The next day, Tom and a few others went door to door. They knocked, explained, and collected signatures. By the end of the week, they had more than 100 neighbors willing to sign a petition demanding the HOA drop the eviction. But Tom didn't stop there. He contacted the local news station, and soon a reporter showed up in front of Martha's little house, interviewing her as she clutched the eviction notice with trembling hands. "I don't want trouble," Martha said softly into the microphone. "This has been my home for over 60 years. I raised my children here. My husband and I built our life here. I just want to stay in my house until the good Lord calls me home." The clip aired that evening, and it spread like wildfire. On social media, thousands of comments poured in, blasting the HOA for cruelty and praising Martha as a pillar of the community. Hashtags popped up, hashtag Stand with Martha, and hashtag HOA Heartless. The following morning, Diane, the HOA president, stormed into the clubhouse looking rattled. "This is getting out of control," she hissed at the other board members. "We're being slandered. Our job is to enforce standards, and she's violating them. That's all." But the tide was turning, and Diane knew it. Cars slowed down in front of Martha's home, some honking in support, others dropping off groceries or flowers on her porch. A group of kids painted signs that said "We love Martha" and taped them to the fence. What Diane thought would be an easy eviction had turned into a full-scale rebellion. Tom, meanwhile, kept building momentum. He reached out to a local veterans group when he learned that Martha's late husband George had been a decorated war veteran. Soon, retired servicemen were standing on Martha's lawn in full uniform, holding flags and signs demanding respect for the widow of a hero. The image made the front page of the local newspaper. Community rallies for 90-year-old widow facing eviction. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, spilling out the doors, all waiting for their chance to speak. Diane tried to keep order, but her gavel was drowned out by angry voices. One neighbor shouted, "Shame on you." Another added, "If you can do this to her, none of us are safe." The pressure was unbearable. Martha sat quietly in the front row, her hands folded, her eyes downcast. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she felt a warmth in her chest as she listened. For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, she didn't feel alone. Diane banged her gavel again. "Order. We will not be intimidated by theatrics. Rules are rules. If Mrs. Jacobs can't comply, she must face the consequences." That was the moment Tom stood up. He held a folder in his hand and walked slowly to the front. "These," he said, laying down sheets of paper on the table, "are signatures from over 200 residents demanding you stop this madness. These," he continued, pulling out another sheet, "are letters from veterans groups, church members, and community leaders. And this," he held up a copy of the newspaper, "is the reputation you're destroying, not just for the board, but for every homeowner here. Is this really worth it?" The room erupted in applause, cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes. Diane's face turned red, but she still refused to back down. "We have legal grounds," she snapped. "The bylaws are clear. Property standards must be maintained. If we cave for one, we open the floodgates." Tom leaned forward, his voice low but carrying across the room. "No, Diane. What you're opening is the door to a lawsuit you will lose. A media storm you can't contain, and a neighborhood divided against itself. You want to talk about protecting property values? Nothing destroys them faster than cruelty broadcast on the evening news." The silence that followed was heavy. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even some of Diane's allies looked uneasy. Martha, sitting quietly in the front row, felt her throat tighten as she watched the community fight for her. She had spent her life giving small acts of kindness, cookies, smiles, words of encouragement, never expecting anything in return. Now, those small seeds had grown into a forest of support. Diane slammed her gavel one last time. "This meeting is adjourned," and with that, she stormed out, leaving her fellow board members behind, looking pale and shaken. But Tom knew the fight wasn't over. Diane was stubborn, and she had money and lawyers behind her. If she wanted to keep pushing, she would, and that meant they had to be ready. That night, as Martha sipped tea at her kitchen table, Tom sat across from her with determination in his eyes. "They won't stop yet, Martha, but neither will we. You've given too much to this community for them to take your home. I promise you this. We're going to win." Martha reached over and squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with tears. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. The days following the explosive HOA meeting were tense. For Martha, every sunrise brought a mix of hope and dread. On one hand, the kindness of her neighbors filled her heart. Casseroles left at her door, flowers blooming in her yard, thanks to volunteers, and handwritten notes tucked in her mailbox telling her to stay strong. On the other hand, the legal letters kept coming, thick envelopes with intimidating seals, threatening court dates and escalating fines. Tom knew they couldn't just rely on public outrage. They needed a legal strategy. He gathered a small group at his kitchen table, a retired lawyer who lived 2 blocks over, a young paralegal studying for the bar exam, and a handful of determined neighbors. Together, they formed what they jokingly called the Martha Defense Committee. But behind the humor was real grit. They combed through the HOA bylaws, cross-referenced state laws on elderly protection, and dug into Martha's history with the community. What they found would change everything. Decades ago, when the HOA was first formed, Martha and her late husband George had actually signed an agreement exempting them from certain fees and responsibilities. Why? Because they had been original landowners who helped the developers gain access to part of the property. The document wasn't widely known, and over the years it had been conveniently forgotten, but the lawyer on Tom's team found it in county records, stamped and dated. Legally, the HOA had no right to find Martha the way they had. When Tom showed Martha the papers, her frail hands trembled as she held them. George. He thought ahead. She whispered. He wanted to make sure I'd always be safe here. Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they weren't from fear. They were from relief. Armed with this evidence, Tom called for another community meeting. This time, the turnout was even larger. News crews lined the sidewalks, microphones were shoved into hands, and the room buzzed with anticipation. When Diane walked in, her usual smugness was replaced with unease. She could feel the tide against her, but she still carried herself like a general marching into battle. Tom stepped up to the front with the document in hand. For weeks, this board has tried to evict a 90-year-old widow over fines she should have never received. Tonight, I'm showing you proof. He held up the stamped county agreement. This paper, signed decades ago, exempts Martha Jacobs from the very fines they've used as a weapon against her. This eviction isn't just cruel, it's illegal. The room erupted in gasps and shouts. Neighbors clapped, reporters scribbled furiously, and even some board members looked horrified. Diane tried to grab the microphone, but Tom wasn't finished. You say you're protecting property values, but what value does a community have when it turns on its own? When it treats the woman who helped build this neighborhood as disposable? His voice grew louder, stronger. We are better than this. And if this board won't do the right thing, then maybe it's time for a new board. The applause shook the walls. Neighbors were on their feet, chanting Martha's name. Diane, red-faced and flustered, snapped back. This is out of context. That document doesn't apply anymore. We still have the right to enforce our standards. But her words were drowned out by boos. For the first time, Diane wasn't in control. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Two of them whispered, then finally spoke up. We don't support this eviction. We vote to drop it immediately. One by one, the others followed, until Diane was alone, standing against a wave she could no longer fight. The vote was unanimous. The eviction was dropped. The fines were erased. Martha could stay in her home, free from harassment. And the community cheered like they'd just won a championship game. That night, Martha stood on her porch, her eyes glistening as she looked at the sea of neighbors gathered on her lawn. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice cracking. I thought I was alone, but you've shown me that I am surrounded by family. Tom stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You gave to this community for decades. Martha, we just gave a little back. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The community, once divided, came together in a way it hadn't in years. Neighbors repainted Martha's shutters, patched her driveway, and replanted her garden with fresh flowers. Kids ran through her yard, laughing, as Martha sat in her rocking chair, smiling brighter than she had in months. And Diane? She resigned within the month, her reputation in ruins. A new board was elected, one that promised to remember that neighborhoods are about people, not just property values. Martha's story became a symbol not just for Willow Creek, but for anyone who had ever felt bullied by an HOA. Letters poured in from across the state, strangers sending love, veterans saluting her husband's memory, families thanking her for reminding them what community should mean. On her 91st birthday, the entire neighborhood threw her a surprise party under the oak tree she and George had planted all those years ago. Balloons floated in the summer air, children sang, and Martha, with tears in her eyes, whispered, "This is what home really is." And that was the victory the HOA could never take away.